In medieval Norway, pilgrimage was a major factor in religious life. In fact, Nidaros, Trondheim, was the fourth most important pilgrimage site in Europe, after Canterbury, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela. So we plan to look at an array of churches and religious sites of all ages, following two of the most important routes of medieval pilgrimage from Oslo to Nidaros. Pilgrimages have great revival in Norway over the last 20 years or so, especially since the disestablishment of the Lutheran Church a few years ago. The reality of medieval pilgrimage, starting off with what you can carry. Most of your food will be from doles from monasteries. Here's St. Cross at Winchester. If you're lucky, you get a space by an inn fire. If not, it's the church porch for you. The pilgrim arrives in town with his wet shoes round his neck to complete the pilgrimage barefoot. And after praying at the shrine, he returns home. This is our friend Steve, who did the pilgrimage from Portsmouth to Canterbury, arriving at Canterbury on the feast of Thomas Becket, 2015, as if he was in 1374. And I would remind you that the feast of Thomas Becket is about 2 days after Christmas, so it was a winter pilgrimage. This is modern pilgrimage in Norway, setting off on the 400-mile trek with what you can carry in the rain. If you're lucky, you find the pilgrim hostel. If not, you need to be carrying your own accommodation and food. At least water is readily available. Finally, the pilgrim makes it to Nidaros. Dave, and Jody made the pilgrimage from Oslo to Nidaros in summer 2014. So we start with the King's Road, the overland pilgrim route running over 400 miles, going pretty much due north from Oslo to Trondheim. The pilgrimage starts at the ruins of the Mariakirke in Oslo. The Mariakirke Church was the royal chapel, and King Haakon V Magnusson, who died in 1319, and his kindred were buried there, which gave the church strong symbolic meaning. It was probably built first as a small wooden church around the year 1000, before a single nave church with a choir and apse was built around 1100. The church was rebuilt with brick in the 14th century, with two large towers to the west and a large cruciform choir. Unfortunately, the church was set ablaze by the Swedes in connection with the attack in 1523. And after the Reformation, it was so dilapidated that it could not be repaired, and it was therefore demolished in 1542. The pilgrim might well stop at the cathedral for a blessing. This is now all that is left of the medieval St. Halvard's Cathedral and forms the cornerstone for the present cathedral. This was consecrated in 1697 and contains fine artworks from recent times in the cathedral, including spectacular stained glass windows in the choir by the Norwegian artist Emanuel Vigeland, which were installed between 1910 and 1916. I would also hold up the cathedral in Oslo as a prime example of how cathedrals should behave. It's open 24/7, and there is always food and coffee available, along with trained listeners. It's a truly wonderful bit of pastoral work, as well as a fascinating building. Setting out from central Oslo along the Pilgrim Way, we pass Old Aker Church, the oldest standing building in Oslo. It was built as a three-naved Roman-style basilica, and unusually for Norway, it's constructed from limestone. It's believed to have been erected by King Olav in 1080, probably on the site of the regional ting or parliament. It was built over an old silver mine, Akersberg, which was in use during the early Viking Age. The mines must have been the inspiration for stories about the church containing hidden silver treasures and even dragon-infested dungeons. Our pilgrimage follows the western shore of Lake Mjøsa, the longest lake in Norway. And here you see pilgrims on the road in this area. The pilgrim then comes to the church at Bondsnes, the reputed birthplace of St. Olav. The story of this church is that Olav returned to Bondsnes, across the fjord in a dreadful storm, and he promised God that if he and his crew survived the ordeal, he would build a church on his stepfather's land. So Bondsnes Church is one of Norway's few votive churches, a church raised to honour a promise to God. Preserved in the church is a wooden figure of the Virgin Mary with child from the 1200s, which was repainted in the 18th century, together with a crucifix from the late 1400s. You can see them in position in the sanctuary there. And in the churchyard stands this modern memorial to St. Olav, Norway's perpetual king. Moving north, we reach Jevnaker Church, which was previously the site of a stone church, possibly built by King Olav Kyrre towards the end of the 11th century. By the early 19th century, new laws meant the stone church was far too small, and attempts to extend the church resulted in damage to the building, leading to its demolition in 1832. The Jevnaker Church was built from timber and located on the same site as the old stone church. It was inaugurated on the 8th of October, 1834, and is the largest church in the area. As you can see, it is, when we say large, we mean large. The impressive and rather theatrical 19th century interior can seat over 700 people. Observe the 3 galleries in the church, really an extraordinary place. From here, the pilgrim route goes on to Granavollen and its sister churches. 2 12th century churches built within 20 years of each other and side by side. They were built by 2 sisters, and the suspicion is this was as a result of squabbles over land, and both of them was trying to assert their right to the land on which the churches stood. From Gran, medieval pilgrim will continue to Dister. Here the pilgrims would pay their respects to the Golden Madonna in the church. The remains of paint and gilding on this early 13th century show she was once truly spectacular. Sadly, the church built in the 1200s was demolished in the 1780s, and nothing but the stone altar remains. Medieval pilgrims would have continued up the west shore of Mjøsa, but most modern pilgrims take the Skibladna paddle steamer across the lake to Hamar. Built in 1856, the Skibladna is the oldest restored paddle steamer in regular use. She still functions as a several times a day ferry. Taking the road out of the city of Hamar, pilgrims reach the ruins of the medieval cathedral, encased in its glass cover. The glass cathedral, erected over the ruins in 1998, has amazing acoustics and is extensively used for both music and regular services. This is a reconstruction of the medieval cathedral, which was begun when Hamar diocese was created in 1153 and was completed around 1200. At the Reformation in 1536, Hamar diocese was placed under Oslo, and the cathedral lost its status and was no longer used. It was destroyed during the Northern 7 Years' War in 1567. This was Sweden's attempt to break Danish dominance of Scandinavia, and gradually decayed, becoming a quarry for local church builders. So medieval pilgrims set off from Hamar, followed by a more modern one. From here, the road crosses the hills to Furnes at the head of Lake Mjøsa. And from Furnes to Brumunddal, the path is virtually unchanged since medieval pilgrims came this way, and leads us to a probably equally unchanged campsite beside Lake Mjøsa. The path leads us on to Ringsaker Church, a massive stone structure built in the 1100s. These Norwegian stone churches were great statements of power, somewhat akin to the building of Norman castles in England. Inside, you can see the sheer scale of this building. It is truly amazing, with a medieval rood group still in place, despite the fact it's now a Lutheran church. Statement of wealth is emphasized by the spectacular altarpiece, Flemish work from about 1530, made in the workshop of Robert Morrow in Antwerp, and including a very, very beautiful tabernacle in the middle of it with little flowers. This is where the host would be kept, consecrated hosts would be kept. Beside the church is the neat and comfortable pilgrim hostel. Onwards we go, and by the path is St. Olav's Spring near Brødum, which reputedly sprang up when the saint needed water for his horse. It seldom, if ever, runs dry. After passing the busy town of Lillehammer, we reach the Pilgrims' Barn at Bokerud, where pilgrims receive a warm welcome at the family table. Next morning, both pilgrim and horse need to get organised. Horse has to have boots put on it because of the stony ground they're going to travel. Northwards from the barn, the pilgrim way goes up Gudbrandsdalen to Forvang Stave Church, which is a very, very heavily restored church. Oops. And Norwegian pilgrims do think rather big in their walking capacity. I find it interesting how little difference there is actually in distance from the point of this sign between Jerusalem and Santiago. It's really quite surprising to me. The next stop on the path is the site of St. Olav's conversion of Dale Gudbrand, the local landlord at Hunsdorf. Here, St. Olaf threw down the idol to Thor, which stood by the mound where the ting, or local parliament, took place. The old pilgrim hostel at Hundorp has been replaced by a smart new museum and hostel, but the path remains unchanged and continues northwards towards the mountains of Dovrefjell. Modern pilgrims arriving at the reconstructed medieval farm of Jørundgaard in Sel, including a modern stave church. The original was built for the filming of Kristin Lavransdatter, but was burnt down as part of the filming, but by local request was rebuilt in 1999 and is now a working church. Dovre Church was built in 1736 as a timber church, but for some reason its walls were covered with huge slices of slate during the restoration in 1840. And from here we go onwards and upwards. This group of pilgrims are a Swedish group of reenactors doing at least a section of the pilgrimage. I don't know how far they actually went, but one of those is a friend of mine, and I thought it would be nice to put his photograph of them in. Pilgrims now arrive at the Folkstuge on Dovrefjell. The origin of this mountain lodge dates back to King Øystein Magnusson about 1120, when he initiated the building of simple shelters to accommodate pilgrims on their way to St. Olav's grave in Nidaros, and the site has been a pilgrim hostel ever since. All summer, pilgrim prayers are held in the Folkstuge's consecrated chapel, Gudshuset, God's house, using the Lauds and Compline liturgy of Nidaros Cathedral, while Mass is celebrated with the liturgy of the Lutheran Church in Norway. It's tempting to stay in a nice cozy bed, but the wide open spaces of Dovrefjell are waiting. Eventually we reach Eysteinkirche, the church on the mountaintop. This church isn't old, dating from 1968, but it's always been a pilgrim church. It's not the first church here, for in 1432, Aslak Bolt mentions a church here in Kirchen to accommodate the pilgrims on their journey over the mountains to Nidaros. There they go. Crossing Dovrefjell is an interesting experience even in summer. We're well up above the tree line and even most vegetation. Accommodation is, to put it mildly, basic, and streams are wide flowing and icy. And the local wildlife would prefer to be left alone. Our pilgrims still have a fair old way to cover. Here it's 208 kilometers still to go. And it's a rather exciting landscape. And the road doesn't get any easier. It's hard to believe that wheeled vehicles could ever have traveled this way, but this is the road that the carriages used to take going north. Coming down from the mountains, some bridges are just a little scary. Walking across that must be a really unnerving experience. You know you're past the worst when you reach the tiny and very basic pilgrim hostel of Rifhusan, the House of the Red Currants. Sorry, it's Riphusan. Coming down from the mountains into the river valley, Plastorgård is the next pilgrim accommodation. Again, very basic. This old small holding has been lovingly restored and furnished by local farmers. Inside, it's cozy and warm. Coming down from the heights, we reach Rennu. The first church here may have been built around the year 1100 and probably was the stave church which was demolished in 1669. The new church was built in Y-shaped form. This shape is a characteristic one for Norway, though only 4 survive today, and we've only got 101 kilometers to go. Inside, these Y-shaped churches were designed to give the maximum contact between a large congregation and the preacher. This is the oldest of the surviving 4 of a once common design, and a 13th century crucifix stands in the new church. The far side of the forest, we reach Skaun. The stone church here was built in 1183, and the church hall offers overnight accommodation for pilgrims. It stands on the site of a previous chapel on the property of the local chief. Built approximately 1040 and extended about 100 years later, probably so that the whole village could attend. In the south gate, a stonemason's mark was discovered, identical to one in the exterior wall of the octagon of Nidaros Cathedral, so a high status building. Inside, the wooden altar frontal is of English workmanship and dates from the early 1200s. Medieval pilgrims may well have stopped here to prepare for reaching Nidaros. This is Sundet Farm, dating from about 1100, and this is the last overnight stop before Trondheim. Here, pilgrims can be rowed across the Gaula River to stay and eat before setting out on the last leg of the journey. And finally, the pilgrims climbed Steinberget, the mountain on which Trondheim is built, now a suburb of the city, and looked down on the cathedral. Here, at the place called Fegensbrekka, the Hill of Joy, where the view of the city is unmatched, the medieval pilgrims stop to enjoy the view, fall on their knees in prayers and praise, before continuing down into the city. The photograph I've got from there was one we took in about almost exactly 2 years ago. So that's February in 2019. And finally, the weary pilgrims would arrive at the west door of the cathedral. Here is the gathering of pilgrims who have arrived to mark St. Olav's Day. So now, far easier than overland was the sea passage to Nidaros. Additionally, it was possible to visit other holy sites on the way. Our pilgrims would probably embark either from the harbour of Oslo itself, close to where the Opera House now stands, or from the harbour at Aker, close by the modern town hall. These would have been busy working and trading ports, unlike the relative peace of today. Bear in mind, though, that both these photographs are right in the middle of a busy capital city, however rural and peaceful they look. From Oslo, one might start by visiting Hovedøya, one of the small islands on Oslo Fjord. Hovedøya Abbey was a Cistercian abbey founded in 1147 by monks from Kirkstead Abbey in England and dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. Edmund. During the medieval period, the abbey was one of the richest institutions in Norway, holding over 400 properties, including a fishery and timber yards. Political turmoil led to the end of the monastery. In 1532, the abbot was thrown into prison for his political involvement, and the abbey was looted and then set ablaze. Any hope the order might have had of restoring the rich abbey was dashed 4 years later when the Reformation arrived. The next port of call would be Drammen, the scene of the martyrdom of St. Halvard, the patron saint of Oslo. The story goes that Halvard Vebjørnsen, who died in 1043, defended a pregnant woman, most likely a slave, who had been given sanctuary on his ship from 3 men accusing her of theft. Halvard, together with the woman, were killed by arrows from the men. The woman was buried on the beach. Halvard's body, however, was bound with a millstone around his neck, which refused to sink, and as a result, the crime was discovered. Halvard and the woman appear on the municipal badge of Oslo, but little remains to commemorate him at Drammen itself. The next port stop would almost certainly have been just down the coast, to pay a visit to the Holy Cross of Borre. From the beach, pilgrims would walk about half a mile inland, past the burial mounds of Viking kings, to the church, which was built about 1100. Borre Cross is now in the Historical Museum of Oslo, and it's first mentioned in a document from about 1350. 3 meters high, It may have been placed above the chancel arch in Borre Church, which was dedicated to St. Nicholas, the patron saint of travellers, and St. Olav. This site was important enough for Queen Margaretha of Denmark to set up a pilgrimage by proxy, sending a member of her court to pray for the Queen's soul. The terminals show 3 evangelist symbols, Mark, Luke, and John, but at the base where we would expect Matthew is the harrowing of hell. Marks in the centre of the cross suggest it once held a relic, possibly the true cross. Borre was one of the most visited pilgrim destinations in Norway after Nidaros. At nearby Tønsberg, one might stop to visit the round St. Olav's Church, owned by the Premonstratensian order. As with the Temple Church in London, this may well have been granted indulgences as a nominal visit to the Holy Sepulchre. The 2 most important pilgrimage churches for Norwegians were Nidaros, the Coronation Church and Shrine of St. Olav, and the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem, the latter being perceived as the centre of Christendom. So the building of a Jerusalem-style church, one of only a handful of stone churches in Norway, dedicated to St. Olav, in the wealthy south of Norway, can be seen as a political statement of dominance and centrality by the Vestfold-based monarchy. Here's a reconstruction of the church. Oops. Today, the ruins of the church remain among the modern civic buildings. And for most people in Tønsberg, they don't even know it's there or really much care. Sailing towards Stavanger, one might drop anchor at Egersund, where from 1292, Pope Nicholas IV named the Maria Church, Ecclesia Beate Maria de Egersunden, in a grant of indulgences. The present church, built in 1692, is thought to stand on the same site. So you would stop there to get your indulgence for all the sins you were going to commit in Stavanger. Pilgrims would then continue their coastal journey around the southern tip of Norway to reach their next main stop on the pilgrimage, the fine cathedral at Stavanger. Stavanger Cathedral is one of the very few churches outside England dedicated to St. Swithin, a very suitable saint for the west coast of Norway, given its customary rainfall. The cathedral contained an arm bone of the saint, probably contained in a reliquary similar to this one. Other relics at Stavanger included a piece of cloth stained with Christ's blood and a piece of the true cross. Additionally, after the fire of 1280, an indulgence of 40 days was given to all who visited St. Swithin's church, or who made donations to its rebuilding. This is what we expected to see when we arrived, and this is what we actually found. The diocese was created in 1125, but under the crypt were found charcoal layers dating from the 9th and 11th centuries, together with 11th century burials, suggested it was started well before Stavanger became a diocese. The church in its oldest form was probably completed by English masons around 1150. In 1272, a fire in the town of Stavanger damaged part of the church. It was rebuilt under the direction of Bishop Arne and essentially reached the form we see today. The nave is English Norman in style, and the choir is very reminiscent of Scottish Gothic. Here in the nave, the arcade is very imposing. The English workmen seem to have enjoyed adding enigmatic details. Who knows what this curious fish-like creature is supposed to represent at the base of a pillar? The choir is far more elegant. It dates from the 13th century and appears to relate closely to Scottish churches of the same period. The soapstone used for architectural detail is easily carved, and there is some really lovely stonework. A short sail north of Stavanger lies Utstein Kloster. It's Norway's best preserved medieval monastery. The abbey, dedicated to St. Lawrence, was founded in its present location during the reign of King Magnus VI of Norway, who died in 1280. The community was the house of Augustinian canons, previously established as St. Olav's Abbey in Stavanger, one of the early Augustinian monasteries in Norway, if not the very earliest. It was well established by 1160. At its height, about 20 to 30 monks lived there, with twice as many lay people working on the building, the cooking, and the farming. After the Reformation, the monastery was uninhabited for a long while, and the buildings decayed. From the 18th century, it was used as a farm, but it was only in the last century that a program of restoration took place, and the monastery is now a museum and conference centre. The cloister itself is well preserved and a pleasant place to rest from journeying, at least in summer. Utstein first appears in the historical record in the 9th century as a palace occupied by King Harald Harfager after the Battle of Hafrsfjord. The monastery was built in the 1260s, but it's possible that some parts of the building are older and are parts of a former royal palace. The church has a unique, for Norway, central tower placed between the chancel and the nave in a separate space. This view inside the abbey church is taken looking west from the chancel, through the tower room to the nave beyond. A bit further north, Kvitsøy, the White Island, seems to have been a holy place for Norwegians since the coming of Christianity. The great stone cross, at least 1,000 years old, is first mentioned in the Snorre saga, where Snorre records a truce being made between St. Olav and Erling Skarlsson under the stone cross. As a scene of a key event in the saint's life, most pilgrims would have wished to stop off here. The next stop will be Avaldsnes on the island of Karmøy. Here, the shipping lane is forced into a narrow passage between Karmøy and the mainland, and it was probably this shipping traffic on the strait which generated the power and riches through the ages. Harald Fairhair chose Avaldsnes for his main royal estate in about 870, making it the oldest royal seat in Norway. According to legend, Olav Tryggvason built Avaldsnes church, apparently as a manor chapel for the king's residence. This would probably have been quite a small post or palisade church. Construction of the present-day church, called St. Olav's Church of Avaldsnes, was started approximately 1250 AD on the orders of King Håkon Håkonsson. It was not completed till nearly 1320. Dedicated to St. Olav, it was one of the greatest Norwegian stone churches of the Middle Ages, and it was one of only 4 royal collegiate churches in Norway. And it was an important station of the pilgrim route to Nidaros, running along the coast. The church stands in a dominant position, overlooking the Kalmsund, the strait between Karmøy and Haugesund. This photo is taken from the pre-Christian burial ground close to the sea. Very close to the north wall of the church stands a tall, narrow megalith called the Virgin Mary's Sewing Needle, which looks as if it's leaning against the church wall. Measuring 7.2 meters, it's one of Norway's highest standing stones, but it has been even higher. It seems to date from about 300 AD and was probably part of a group of stones marking a ritual or assembly site. It's thought that the first church was built somewhere between 995 and 1000. And according to tradition, Olav Tryggvason built his small wooden church in the middle of the sacred place of heathen cult. The second church is supposed to have been built by St. Olav. Thus, Håkon's large stone church is the third church situated in the same place. Old legends tell us that doomsday will come when the stone touches the church wall. So in times gone by, priests at Avaldsnes, under cover of darkness, have climbed up the stone and chipped pieces from the top, thus saving the world from destruction. The name of the stone comes from a runic inscription, Mikael Maria Nestor, which means Michael, the next after Mary, which suggests the Christian settlers identified the pagan deity of the place with St. Michael. This would link up with the doomsday legend, as Michael was known to be the angel who would sound a horn to signal the end of the world. Originally, it's thought to have been one of 5 huge standing stones erected here, probably in the 3rd century. Today, only the gap between the church wall and doomsday is only 9.2 centimeters. As we look from Haugesund, we can see Salhus, the white houses by the cement works. Here was the pilgrim hostel known as the Soul House. Pilgrims would disembark here, stay here, and use their time to visit sites on the island. They would always enter the church by the north door and leave by the south, keeping their backs firmly to the malign north, which was known to be the road to hell. From the church, they might make their way north to St. Olav's Well at Torvastad, on the west coast of the island. The legend claims that Olav was followed by enemies through the Strait Kalmsund. He sailed his ship round to the west side of the island, and from here the king and his men started to drag the ship overland from Torvastad to Vikingstad. The hard work made them thirsty, and the king stabbed his clenched fist in the rock. Immediately came roaring up clear water so that everyone could drink. The well never runs dry, and many people have witnessed the healing power of the water, which is supposed to be especially good when it comes to curing eye diseases. Pilgrims who drank the water used to put small mounds of wood or straw near the well. And modern pilgrims still visit the spring on St. Olav's Day, as here. Returning to their ship at Salhus, the pilgrims might stop to see the 5 foolish virgins, another group of 4th century megaliths surrounding a burial, and on the mainland side of today's bridge. St. Olaf was sailing back to the royal estate at Avaldsnes, and when he passed the narrowest point of the strait, he saw 5 lovely girls standing on the mainland side beckoning him. The king didn't allow himself to be tempted, but cried out, "Now stay there and turn to stone until I come back again." Immediately they turned into stone, and they're still standing there, looking over the strait to St. Olaf's church, waiting for the king to return. Moving on, Monster would have been an important stop on the journey, as it was supposedly where the first church in Norway was built by Olav Tryggvason in the year 998, when Christianity was officially first introduced to Norway. About 1024, Olav II of Norway, later St. Olaf, held a ting or assembly at Munster, where the oldest Christian law was introduced in Norway, converting the kingdom to Christianity officially. The current stone church was probably built around the site of 1150, on the site of the original wooden church. Halsney Abbey was a house of Augustinians a bit further north up the coast. And this monastery is believed to have been founded in 1163 or 64 by the Jarl Erling Skacha as an inducement to Archbishop Eystein to crown his 7-year-old son, Magnus Erlingsson, as King of Norway. The new foundation attracted many generous endowments and soon became one of the wealthiest in Norway. The buildings were severely damaged in a fire about 100 years later and were rebuilt in Gothic style about 1300. The monastery was dissolved in 1536 and the assets were confiscated by the crown. Sound familiar? For over 200 years, it was administered as state property, but in 1758, it was bought by the Chamberlain Andreas Jure, in whose family it remained until 1956. Where Andreas Jure, a descendant of the purchaser, demolished the remaining monastic buildings about 1840 and built a new house in the area in 1841. Halsnøy is so very unusual among Norwegian monastic sites, and what survives is not the principal monastic buildings, church, chapter house, and so on, but all the smaller ancillary buildings. These survive on only 2 other pre-Reformation monastic sites in the country. But these days it's a centre for tourism and also for weddings. The next major stop was Bergen, a major port and a central stopping off point for provisioning and rest. And this is the medieval seafront in Bergen, the Brygge. At Bergen, the pilgrims would have visited Christ Church, where the cathedral, where the relics of St. Sunniva were preserved. The westward view of the ruins shows quite how close the cathedral lay to the harbour. Well-connected pilgrims might have had a chance to visit the Royal Chapel of the Holy Apostles, built in 1257, to house the recently acquired relic of a holy thorn, possibly housed in a reliquary like this one at the British Museum. Sailing north from Bergen, the medieval pilgrim would have pressed on to Kinn, the home of St. Sunniva's sister Borni, who had left Ireland with Sunniva and washed up on this island. After she arrived on Kinn, St. Borni contracted with a local man to build a church that still stands on Kinn. He said he would do so if Borni would marry him, but Borni was as horrified at marrying him as Sunniva had been horrified at the idea of marrying a Viking. So he changed his offer. He would build the church, and if she could guess his name before he was finished, she would not have to marry him. When the church was nearly finished, Borni travelled to a neighbouring island and heard the builders' folk singing his name in honour of his presumed upcoming nuptials. So Borni returned, called the builder by his name, and so shocked him that he dropped the belfry on the ground next to the church, where it's to be seen today, instead of installing it on top of the church. Inside Kinn Church is a fine 13th century rood loft, a rare survival and incredibly beautifully carved. And the Kinn play, put on annually, tells the story both of St. Sunniva and her sisters, and of the arrival of Lutheranism imposed by the Danes. The next stop was Selje, an important Christian site for Norway. The location of the original shrine of St. Sunniva was believed to have been martyred here, and for that reason was a place of pilgrimage. And it was also the seat of a bishopric and a cathedral dedicated to St. Michael, established about 1070. Its importance as a pilgrimage site declined after the transfer of the diocese and the relics to Bergen. St. Sunniva's cave on Selje, the site of her martyrdom. Sunniva was, we're told, a pious and beautiful Irish princess of the mid-10th century, who fled across the sea with a number of loyal attendants, having inherited a kingdom, to avoid being forced to marry against her will. She landed in pagan Norway, where she and her followers met their martyrdom on the island of Selje. It is said that Sunniva and her followers took refuge in this cave after landing on the island. The locals suspected the foreigners of stealing their sheep, and the ruler Håkon Jarl was sent for. Sunniva and her followers prayed to God that they should not fall into the hands of the heathens, upon which rocks fell down, blocking the entrance to the cave. So Sunniva and the others died in the cave. But in the years to come, miracles were reported on the island. When the Christian king Olav was investigated the cave in 996, the body of Sunniva was found intact. Later, a Benedictine monastery, Selje Abbey, was built on the site, the ruins of which can still be seen. Selje is a place of pilgrimage is first mentioned by Adam of Bremen, about 1070, who vaguely links it to some of the 11,000 virgins in the legend of St. Ursula. Sunniva was translated to Bergen in 1170, and it seems that the legend that has come down actually dates from about then. Pilgrims still drink from Sunniva's well. Pilgrimage is still very much a big thing in Kien and Selje. In this day and age, a generalized Christian spirituality centered on a female saint has an appeal to those reacting from the male-centered structure of the historical Lutheran Church. Further north, Bessøy was a strategic location for the medieval coastal routes. The southern branch of Romsdalfjorden led up the valley to Lesje, and from there it followed the pilgrim trail over Dovrefell to Nidaros for those who wished to complete the pilgrimage on foot. The eastern branch led through the Langfjorden, where they hauled their ships over the 5-kilometer low-lying isthmus at Eidsvåg in order to avoid a particularly dangerous stretch of coast, and then back onto the main shipping route. Old Veøy Church is the only survivor of 3 medieval churches on Veøya and dates from about 1200. The next stop would have been the small stone church on the island of Edøy, which would have been the last church before arriving in Trondheim. Pilgrims would have stopped here to make confessions and hear mass before arriving at their final goal. As they approached Trondheim, they will perhaps have caught sight of the island monastery of Tautra, dedicated to Our Lady. In 1207, the Cistercian monastery of Tautra was founded here by monks from Lysekloster near Bergen, itself an offshoot of Fountains. The site was an attractive one, and the earlier foundation of Munkby Abbey seems to have been transferred here shortly after the foundation of this house. The abbey grew wealthy and powerful, and its abbots often played a major part in Norwegian politics. It was dissolved in 1537 and its lands passed to the crown, but the sizable ruins of the church can still be seen. The present Tautra convent is the first permanent Cistercian settlement in Norway since the Reformation and was founded in 1999. It's a small community of nuns. Munkby was a pre-existing Cistercian house, quite possibly another English foundation, the assets of which were transferred to Tautra after the latter's foundation. It was dedicated to St. Bretiva, whose feast day is the 11th of January. On this day, any leftovers from Christmas feasting were mixed into a single dish to be eaten up. All the Christmas ale was finished, feasting was over. A community of Cistercian monks is in the process of being established at Munkby Abbey, the first new foundation by the mother house of the order, Citeaux, since the 13th century. There are 5 monks, all originally French, living and working there. Like the medieval Cistercians, they're principally farmers, and their main income comes from the award-winning cheese they produce. Approaching Nidaros on the north side of the fjord, our pilgrims would have seen a Rheinkloster, St. Andrew nunnery, built in the 1220s on the site of a royal residence in fulfillment of a vow after recovering from an illness by Duke Skule Bardsen. The first abbess was his half-sister, Sigrid Bårdsdottir, and his daughter, Margaret of Norway, Queen of Håkon Håkonsson, spent her last years there. It survived the Reformation because a noblewoman of the time got herself appointed as the administrator and then protected the nunnery from the Danish crown, the abbess and nuns continuing in residence until her death in 1549. Nowadays, it houses a microbrewery. Finally, our pilgrims would arrive in Trondheim. In the very early days of pilgrimage, the pilgrims would have gone to St. Clement's Church in Trondheim. After Olav was killed in battle at Siklestad, his body was first hidden in that town, then buried close to the church, and a year later exhumed and placed in his church of St. Clement. Excavations of the site in 2016 showed a sequence of churches on this site, the earliest of which seems to be the one built by St. Olav, though it's possible that this was at least in part an earlier church built by Olav Tryggvason. It's thought that Olav was buried under the altar platform, visible to the right of this picture. Some of the timbers of the post church survived and have yielded a felling date of 1008. The church was rebuilt sometime in the 12th century, probably about the same time as the cathedral was started, and Olav's bones were shifted to a new shrine there. For those who remember Mike's talk a fortnight ago, just look at the lovely axe marks on that flat surface. Now we move to the Nidaros Cathedral itself. The very heavily restored west front as it greets us now. It's covered with saints, some easily identified, some rather more obscure, at least to the English visitor. Here we see Bishop Øystein, the founder of the cathedral, with a wreath in his hands, St. Halvard, St. Sunniva, and St. Olav. And then below them, Olav Tryggvason, St. Sigurd, and St. Clement. A few medieval statues do survive on the front, but most of them are modern. Even before entering the cathedral, the pilgrim might buy his souvenirs, badges of the saint or of his axe, and most importantly, a pilgrim jar to fill with water from the holy well in one of the chapels off the octagon. The mold for making axe badges is from Ludöse in Sweden, and the one of St. Olav from Trondheim Church, right up in the north of Norway. Pilgrims would have entered through the north door into the north transept, where the original dedication inscription still runs along a string course. They would then enter the cathedral and take the processional route round the octagon before reaching the easternmost chapel, where Olav's shrine was. There were 3 nested shrines. The first was the original wooden coffin from Stiklestad, covered with rich cloth. The second was a costly shrine that, according to Snorri Sturluson, was made by King Magnus Olafsson in the 1040s, Olaf's son. This shrine was probably a wooden coffin covered with silver plates with religious motifs. To the silver plates were fixed valuable jewels. The shrine was 2 meters long and with a width and height of about 80 centimeters. The lid had the shape of a house roof, and the original coffin was kept inside this shrine. Outside this was a third massive silver shrine of a later date. When the Catholic Church dedicated to St. Olav was built in Oslo, it was presented with what purported to be a reliquary containing the arm bone of St. Olav. A few years ago, the reliquary was opened and proved to contain a left tibia, a leg bone. However, subsequent investigations have shown it to be a man of the 11th century, of the right sort of age, and probably killed in battle. So it is entirely possible that this is a genuine relic of St. Olav. The pilgrim would then visit the side chapel, which housed the miraculous spring, and fill their pilgrim ampulla with the miracle-working water. These 2 ampullae were found on North Karmøy and may either have been used to fill from St. Olav's spring there or from the spring in the cathedral here. The St. John Chapel houses a copy of the altar frontal, which once stood in the octagon. Here's a replica of the frontal. And you can see at the bottom left, Olav rides into battle. Bottom right, he is killed. Top left, his soul rises straight to heaven. And on the top right, his tomb is opened and his body is found to be incorrupt. Modern pilgrims arrive and fill the cathedral for St. Olav's festival. Before leaving the cathedral, our medieval pilgrim would almost certainly attend Mass and quite probably inscribe a memento of his visit on the nice soft soapstone walls. Just a pilgrim cross, or I made a pilgrimage, or just Sigurd was here. All that remains for our pilgrims then is to collect their certificates, rest up, and go home. And so we come to the end. So we have St. James, the patron of pilgrims, and St. Olav, the patron of Norway. These photographs were taken on St. Olav's Day, the 29th of July, 2013, 5 days after the Santiago de Compostela derailment, when a train traveling from Madrid to Ferrol in northwest Spain derailed at high speed on a bend about 4 kilometers outside the railway station at Compostela, leaving about 140 injured and 79 dead. In consequence, St. James has been given a wreath as well as St. Olav, and the wreaths carry ribbons in the Spanish national colours. And there we are.